Okay, so here we go. So you should have your lecture notes for the introduction to Esther. Go ahead and get those and complete them as we go through this. So the first line says the conundrum of Esther. What's a conundrum?
Problem.
It's a problem, right?
Yeah.
So what is the problem with Esther? Esther is atypical of Old Testament writings. It's not typical. It's weird. It's different from anything else in the Old Testament. In fact, Kieran Job says this about Esther. Other than the fact that the story is about the Jewish people, there is nothing Jewish about it in the religious sense. In fact, God's name is never mentioned. It is the only book of the Bible where God's name is never mentioned. Nor is Jerusalem or the temple. Never mentioned. There's no mention of prayer or the law. In fact, the people in the story exhibit no concern for the law whatsoever. Nothing even remotely miraculous happens. At least nothing of biblical proportions, as we say. It really isn't a religious book at all, except it's in the Old Testament canon for both Jews and Christians. The next conundrum about Esther is that it has flawed characters, like really flawed characters. Now that's to be expected because we're all human. We're all dirty, rotten sinners deserving hell. However, the writer doesn't make the slightest comment on the morality of the actions of the characters. Even when they're horrifically immoral, the author doesn't make any judgment at all. It's not like other places in the Old Testament where we're told so-and-so did evil in the sight of the Lord, or so-and-so did what was right in the sight of the Lord. Was it a bad thing or a good thing for Esther to conceal her Jewish identity, to ignore dietary laws, and to join the harem of a pagan king? The author doesn't tell us. It wasn't no beauty pageant. I'll just give you a little spoiler alert right now. There was no beauty pageant.
There was no island of tickling.
And there was no island of tickling.
There was no song about puppies.
If they told the real story, VeggieTales would not be able to do it. So was it a good thing or a bad thing for her to conceal her Jewish identity, to ignore dietary laws, and to join the harem of a pagan king? The author doesn't tell us. He makes no judgment one way or the other. What were the characters thinking? What were their motivations? Were they good or bad? The author doesn't tell us. We're left to make our own inferences, and we will. All of which is part of why the book was ignored by commentators for centuries. John Calvin, whose set of commentaries is over there, never preached on it, and he did not include it in his commentaries. He has an exhaustive commentary set of all of the Bible, except Esther. It's not even in it. And Martin Luther, for my Lutheran friends, was downright negative toward Esther.
Yeah.
In fact, Luther wished that Esther had never come into the canon because it has, quote, too many heathen unnaturalities. But it is part of the canon, both Jewish and Christian. And it's there for a reason. It is a divinely inspired story that has much about God, about God's plan of salvation, and about us. That is, in fact, that is the point, in fact, of the entire Old Testament. is to teach us. Romans 15:4 says, whatever was written in the past was written for our learning, that we might learn from it. So I'm just going to give you a little historical background. You can relive the happy memories of 7th grade world history here with me. We're going to start with Solomon. So Solomon was the son of David. David was who? King of Israel. He was the king of Israel. His son Solomon becomes king after him, and Solomon amassed a huge fortune and a powerful government, along with a plethora of wives and concubines, but that's a story for another day. We'll just set that aside for now. Shortly after Solomon's death, the northern tribes refused to follow Solomon's son Rehoboam, who was supposed to be the next king. So the northern kingdom revolts against Rehoboam in favor of Jeroboam. Obviously, Solomon and however many of his wives weren't very creative in their naming of their sons. Rehoboam and Jeroboam.
Maybe they were from the same one.
Who knows? I mean, yeah, what are the odds? The northern tribes revolt, and the kingdom was divided into two parts. Israel in the north, which included Samaria, and Judah in the south, which included Jerusalem. Israel, the northern kingdom, was defeated by the Assyrians in 722 BC. Judah was defeated by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon in 586 BC. So they lasted 150-ish, I think. I don't do the math very well BC, even worse than I do AD. But after they fell after the northern kingdom. The Jews of Judah, and in fact that's where the name Jews comes from the lion, the tribe of Judah. So that's where we get the name Jews. The Jews of Judah were carried into exile in Babylon. Not all of them, but anyone of any standing, anyone of any with any education, or wealth or help, anybody that could help them in Babylon, they were taken off to exile in Babylon. And this singular event in history had and still has a tremendous impact on shaping the course of Judaism. In fact, even to this day, when you look at ancient Jewish history, it's often divided into the pre-exilic period and the post-exilic period. Pre-exile, post-exile. Kind of like BC AD, but for them it's pre-exile, post-exile. Life in exile, religious life in exile, was very different than life in Judah. There was no temple. There were no priests. There were no sacrifices. Where did the Jews go to worship? Where? The temple in Jerusalem. What did they do there?
Offered sacrifices.
They made sacrifices. Who did that for them?
The priests.
Didn't have any of that. And so they could not function as God had commanded in exile. So religious life for the Jews in exile centered on the study of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. It's actually very similar to Judaism today. There's no temple. There are no sacrifices. There's no priest. And so the law, the Torah, is what is studied and taught. So they do eventually return to Palestine. In fact, the prophets foretold it. Through the prophets, God promised to return the Jews to their homeland, and he did. The Babylonians were defeated by the Persians. And the Persians took over the the Babylonian Empire, and their king, Cyrus the Great, also known as Cyrus II, released the Jews from captivity and allowed them to return to their homeland. By the way, the story of Babylon's defeat can be found both in ancient history books as well as in the Old Testament, in the Bible, in Daniel 5. It's a very interesting story. While in a drunken stupor, the king of Babylon, Belshazzar, was defeated by Cyrus and his kingdom without even a battle. I love this part, October 12th, 539. We're in Quiz Bowl. Maybe that's going to be October 12th, 539. And so it was that God fulfilled his promise to his people through a pagan king. Interesting. So the Persian Empire lasted about 200 years, from 539 BC to 330 BC. And some of the Jews returned to Palestine. And by Cyrus's decree and with his money and his goods, rebuilt the temple using the resources of Persia. Also rebuilt the wall as well. You can read about that in Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra helped rebuild the temple. Nehemiah helped rebuild the wall around Jerusalem. However, most of the Jews remained in Persia, establishing their lives there. Look, if they were in captivity for about 70 years, right? Not only would all your lives would you have lived in captivity, but your parents' lives and probably your grandparents' lives. So we're on a third generation at least. And they had children younger back then, so maybe a fourth generation. That had all lived in Persia, had lived first in the Babylonian Empire and then the Persian Empire. So some of the Jews returned, but most of the Jews remained in Persia, establishing their lives there. And while those who returned labored and struggled to rebuild the temple and reestablish the kingdom, the Jews in Persia lived as they always had. So the story of Esther takes place about 50 years after the Jews were allowed to return. And it centers on the Jews who chose to remain in Persia rather than return to their homeland. It occurs during the reign of King Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes. That's what we'll call him because it just kind of brings up a bunch of phlegm if you keep saying Ahasuerus. So that's a lot harder to say. So we'll call him Xerxes. Xerxes ruled Persia from 486 BC and 460 to 465 BC. Herodotus, an ancient Greek historian, wrote that Xerxes was the tallest and most handsome of the kings of Persia. I imagine that wasn't such a tough contest. I don't think the Persian men were probably that. Anyway, we won't go into that. That he was the most handsome of the kings of Persia and also an ambitious, ruthless ruler, a brilliant lawyer, and a jealous lover. The setting is Susa, S-U-S-A. It was a capital city. I think the winter capital, if I'm remembering correctly, but that's like somewhere way back here that I'm grabbing that. Of the empire. So here is the big theological question of the day for the Jews. The question was, are we still God's people? Were the people who chose not to return still God's people? Were they still children of the covenant? And would God honor his promises to them? Those are the questions that lie at the heart of the story of Esther. So we're going to talk about the authorship and date. This shouldn't take long. Author, the book makes no claim of authorship. The author is unknown. No idea who wrote this book. The date, the author seems to be writing from a bit of a distance, like after Xerxes' reign had ended, but there's no way to know how long after. An argument can be made, I won't go into the details, but can be made and has been made for about 100 years or less after the events, so late 5th century to early 4th century BC. But the truth is that the date and the authorship are unknown, other than to say that it was between the late 5th and 3rd centuries, somewhere in there. So there are also some historical issues with the book of Esther. When I teach at camp, have I mentioned you can go to camp with me, Josh? No? Any of you go. And I'm storytelling there, and whenever I tell a story from the Bible, I hold up the Bible and I say, this story is in the Bible. Does that mean it's a real story or it's a pretend story? And of course, all these 7 to 11-year-olds go, it's a real story. And I say, yes, it is. This is a real story. And the author's intention is that he's writing about historical events. And nothing in the book has been proven untrue. But there are a few problematic issues, mostly having to do with names. And each can be explained, especially given the literary style of the author. We'll discuss some of those problematic issues as we go. Let's talk about the names, for example. The names were likely chosen to convey something about the person. In other words, Vashti, Queen Vashti, the first queen who gets deposed. I'm told that Bailey played her in 4th grade.
Yeah.
So that Vashti literally means beloved or beautiful woman. So he may have taken Vashti's real name and changed it to Vashti to convey who she was. Yes, ma'am?
This is right here to people.
Okay, William.
Done.
And Ahasuerus loosely means king headache when pronounced in Hebrew, which is a fairly appropriate name.
Yeah.
That doesn't make the story untrue. My number one absolute favorite singer is Randy Stonehill. I know you all love him too. No, you've never heard of Randy Stonehill. Your parents have never heard of Randy Stonehill. Your grandparents probably have never heard of Randy Stonehill. But you can thank Randy Stonehill and his then best friend, Larry Norman, for all of the contemporary Christian music you're listening to, because they invented the genre. And I love Randy Stonehill because his lyrics, he can make you laugh. And sometime I'll play Great Big Stupid World for you. He can make you laugh and think at the same time. Like, oh, that's profound and also terribly funny. When I met him and I had him sign my favorite actual album, I told him like with tears, like, you made me so much. He's like, you're so sweet. And so I got a picture with him. Randy Stonehill has a song called Sarah. Sarah, will you love me? Will you open up a while? Something, and it goes through in Sarah. It talks about Sarah. It's a true story. The woman's name was Janet. Janet doesn't play in lyrics as well as Sarah does, right? Janet's a fine name. It's just not as pretty in lyrics as Janet is. That doesn't make the story untrue that he changed the name. So that's some of the issues with the story of Esther. The real problem is that we put our modern expectations on ancient literary forms. We expect a factual story to be told in a journalistic style, like on the news or in the newspaper. But that's a literary form that was unknown to the ancient writers. That's not how they told true stories in ancient times. Ancient and particularly Hebrew authors preferred storytelling as the way to convey actual events. We tend to think of storytelling as being fairy tales, as being fictional. But the writers of the Old Testament had no problem communicating actual historical events through the vehicle of storytelling, such as the story of Esther. And it's in fact, storytelling is how we relate true events all the time. It's no secret, you've known this well for a long time, that I love telling stories. I love hearing stories. Heck, I'm a storyteller Amy at camp. It doesn't mean the story isn't true. When I would pick up my kids after school, I would always ask them how their day was. The boys, it was a little harder. In fact, at one point, about 3 weeks into 7th grade with Lane, and I would say, "How was your day?" And he'd say, "Good." I'd wait, and nothing come out. And finally, about 3 weeks, I was like, "Dude, you're gonna have to give me something, because if you don't give me, I'm gonna pull it out of you. I'm gonna make you tell me about your day. So you might as well just spill." Katie, I had no problem. Katie gets in the car. "How was your day?" And sometimes I got a recitation. Well, in choir we sang this, and in math we did this, but most of the time I got a story. There was this kid in choir that was so disrespectful to Mr. Reimer, and I just wanted to punch him because he was, telling me a story. I never questioned the truthfulness of that story. She wasn't making up, there weren't any flying pigs or, aliens coming in. I believed the story. Just because she told it as a story didn't make it untrue. Now, and we'll end with this. So there's a feast that the Jews still celebrate today that is based on the events here. It's called Purim, Purim, Purim. And it's still celebrated today. All these thousands, all these millennia later, the Jews still celebrate. In fact, they will be celebrating it on February 25th and 26th this year, just in a couple of weeks. And it has been celebrated from the time Mordecai instituted it in the Old Testament. It would be a very hollow ceremony indeed if these events never happened. If they were fabricated, like Martin Luther King Day, with no Martin Luther King and no civil rights struggle. What are we celebrating? That very feast is proof, and its antiquity is proof that this is a true story. Again, there's no reason to not believe the story of Esther. So we'll treat it as a true story, because it is. Tomorrow we'll pick up with, did I stop here? Got 5 minutes. Yeah, no, I'm going to do this, because I did it in the last class. So let's talk about the themes of Esther, and then I know I lied. The themes of Esther, and then we'll get to, we'll stop. So here's the major theological point of Esther. It's this: God fulfills his covenantal promises to his people through his providence. God fulfills his covenantal promises to his people through his providence. And that is most often how God works, through everyday, ordinary events. Not through miracles. God does do those. But he more often works through providence. Therefore, God's providence is the major theme of Esther. Other themes include the interplay between God's providence and human action. How does that work? What's God? What's us? Is he controlling us? Is he that whole thing? Pride is another theme, and its self-deceptive and destructive nature. Pride goes before the fall, and we'll see that literally in Esther. Banquets and celebration are another theme. And it's fitting then that Purim, includes feasting and celebrating as part of their
Banquets and
celebration. Feasting and celebrating is part of what Purim is about. And then finally, a sudden turn of events. I'm going to even teach you a new word that means a sudden turn of events. Everything looks like it's going this way, and all of a sudden, and it's going the other way. Happens a number of times. So here's the point. Here's the point of Esther. The story of Esther is about an event, a decree of death, that was supposed to bring about the destruction of the Jews. But because of a sudden turn of events, it actually resulted in the destruction of their enemies. The Jews were delivered rather than destroyed. The Jews were delivered rather than destroyed. I would have this on the PowerPoint, but I do have it on the PowerPoint. But I'm going to read to you from Karen Jones. The first of many times I'll read to you. It says this: the author is suggesting that beneath beneath the surface of even seemingly insignificant human decisions and events, an unseen and uncontrollable power is at work that can be neither explained nor thwarted. Because this story is in the canon of the Jews and subsequently the Christians, it is proper to construe that unseen power as God, even though God is never mentioned. What is the divinely inspired author of Esther trying to say to his readers about God? What does Esther tell us about the God that we serve? So that's it for today. We'll pick up with the theology of Esther and hopefully a PowerPoint. Bye.